Hi folks, it's great to see you all again. I'm just doing a quick recording around introducing you to critical reflection for HSP315. I've got some slides for this one and I'll be hopefully slotting them into the presentation up here as I go because I've figured out how to edit these things now. Woot! Winning! Okie dokie. So, I do like this particular image on this first slide because it demonstrates what we're not doing in your assignment. The type of critical reflection that we're doing in this assignment is very different to the one that I've got demonstrated on that first slide. So what you'll get out of this particular lecture is we'll talk about what is critical reflection, obviously. We'll talk through this a little bit. What is involved in doing critical reflection and what's a strategy for critical reflection, because there are a few different types of these hanging around, I suppose. Okie dokie. Why critical reflective practice for police? I just wanted to talk through this because it can be a bit strange sometimes. People think, well, this is just a waste of my time. I don't understand why I have to learn about this. And to be honest, I really have my doubts about how successful this assignment would be. But so far, I've had some people, typically people will tell me when they're in their recording that they really enjoyed the assignment, that they appreciated having time that they've never had before to actually think about a difficult situation that they encountered as a police officer. So I think critical reflection is very beneficial, but police officers don't often think about it as something, as being beneficial until we do this assignment. And they seem to get a lot out of it. So far, I haven't had anybody go, this was a waste of my time, at least not to my face. So it's an absolutely crucial element of degree programs. And this comes from the reading by Copley, Reflective Practice for Policing Students. It's important that we teach students, obviously, to think in critical ways. It also helps students learn, not only what to do, but why they are doing it a lot of the time, as well as what not to do and all of that sort of stuff. It really does get you thinking at that deeper level. It does make it easier to deal with real life situations, to adapt, change and think of different ways of doing something, thinking outside the box, I guess. So I like this particular image on this slide of the police officer sitting there because it, when we think about reflection, tends to be what people think about, that mindfulness stuff, the situation where we need to go to yoga, all of those types of things. That's not what we're thinking about in this particular unit. I would encourage everybody to do that sort of stuff because it's really important for health and well-being, but for the most part, we're talking about something a little bit different in this unit. A lot of people also criticise critically reflective thinking, for officers at least, as kind of a luxury that you can't afford. You've got very limited time as it is, and you really haven't got the space or the time to be thinking in this frame, I suppose. Some people talk about how it's not workable, there's not enough time, the pressures of work are too much. But the reality is that the busier you are as an officer, the more you need critically reflective thinking. And there's a lot of people that continue to argue this point in a lot of ways. We see incidences where officers are making very quick judgments about situations where if they'd had a little bit more time and space to think through, which you often don't, you might have been able to come up with a different scenario. All right, so we have got a bit of research that says the more pressure we are under, the more each of us needs to think clearly and carefully about some different things. And Thompson & Thompson talks about these really well. What are my roles and duties? Am I clear about what's expected of me? What are my goals overall and how am I able to achieve these? What are my priorities and what's the best use of my time? These are all things that you think of when you're doing study in particular, and before you do study. You think about what your goals are, what you want to get out of your study, then you do your study, and as you're doing that, it helps to develop your pathway, your career pathway as you're moving forward. What strategies are available to me to manage time pressures that I face? Who can I rely on to support me? This is very, very important for police officers because trust is absolutely crucial. Who can I collaborate with? And if there are people that you can't for whatever reason, or you feel quite awkward about doing that with them, then you actually need to go and have a chat to somebody and ask, talk to them about why and what the issues are and how you can move forward. And of course, what previous learning can I draw on to help me cope with the current challenges? The Copley reading is really useful because it tells you about what reflective practice is, and if there is anything that you should read, it's definitely this one. Sometimes I find that this reading is focused a little bit too much on learning. This is not what this research assignment is about. It's a little bit different to that. There are aspects of the chapter, though, that are really useful about reflective learning. There's other things that Copley talks about, the Kolb experiential learning cycle, which is really useful. So I'd recommend having a little bit of a read about that. And they step through, sorry folks, frog and throat again. I'll get there eventually. They step through the four processes, I suppose, of this experiential learning cycle. You have the concrete experience, you have that sort of moment of reflective observation where you're thinking, something didn't go quite right about this, I'm not quite sure what, I have to think through it. Then there's this process they called abstract conceptualization and active experimentation, which I'll talk about more now. So the concrete experiences is usually a new or unfamiliar event. It's where you're learning about a new theory or a new process or being involved in a new event overall. So for a recruit, it might be an arrest. You've never done one before. You've had those scenarios in the past, but this is the first time you've been able to put that into practice. So that's your concrete experience. Your reflective observation is when you think back on it, the event that took place, remembering all the things that happened during that event. And often people do this. You might do it when you're sitting in the car on your way home. You might do it sitting around the dinner table with your significant others. You might do it when you're laying in bed that night thinking through it. But it doesn't necessarily go much further than that. Abstract conceptualization is where you start to make sense of it. You think about the knowledge that you've got, you reshape this to include the experiences of the event. That can lead to new theories about the situation, new skills, new ideas, new pieces of knowledge. This can sometimes happen when you're having conversations with other police officers about it too. You might have a bit of a debrief where you think, well, this worked, but this didn't work so well. Still not sure why, but at least I know that didn't work. So then active experimentation is a process that you work through. Once you've developed that new learning or that new thinking about that situation, you can test it out in other situations. It's a true learning means that you're putting these new ideas into practice. Now, what we're doing in this unit is sort of going into a fifth level, I suppose, but it needs to come in between abstract conceptualization and active experimentation. It's where you're going off to the research literature and you're finding some reading about that particular incident, the best practice reading, and you're going and having a read so that you can learn from that. Then once you've done that learning, that's when you're moving into that active experimentation process. I hope that makes sense. There's two types of reflective practice that Sean talks about, which is quite useful. There's reflecting on action, the type of stuff that we talked about above. That makes you a reflective practitioner, exploring ideas of practice after an event in order to formulate new understandings of what happened and develop new skills. But then a reflexive practitioner is something different. It's where you're reflecting in action. You're thinking on your feet. Police are doing that a lot, of course. How individuals are making sense of practical situations while they're involved in them. What are the different ways that you're making use of the resources available to you, all of those types of things. And of course, the ability to assess situations very deeply, apply existing knowledge, and adapt to the situation that you're dealing with. So that's what a reflexive practitioner is doing. And that's what Sean talks about in their work. Now this is useful, but this is only reflective learning. We haven't got to the critical part yet. And again, I love this particular cartoon for noting the importance the critical importance of criticality in this particular incidence. So Thompson and Thompson gives us a little bit of useful information about what critical reflective practice looks like. You need to be able to use knowledge critically, develop a critical perspective that involves a couple of different things, according to Thompson and Thompson. It doesn't accept the situation at face value, and it looks beneath the surface to see what assumptions and forms of reasoning are influencing the circumstances. This is what they call critical depth, okay? So this might be things where you've picked up the morning newspaper. It's got this fabulously outlandish headline about young people and the fact that there's a crime wave, a youth crime wave in Tasmania, right? That this is what you've seen on the newspaper. And you're sitting there and thinking, I don't think that youth crime has really gone up that much in Tasmania. So you've got to think deeper than what you're seeing on the front newspaper. The newspaper's here, thinking deeper. You've literally just done it. You've said, I don't know if I necessarily believe that because I haven't heard that there's any specific rise in youth crime in Tasmania, right? So by going deeper, you've done that thinking process. But you can move a little bit further deeper by going and finding some statistics. What does the Australian Institute for Criminology say about youth crime? Well, it says that it's either fairly steady or it's actually decreasing across Australia. So you know that this fabulous newspaper cover here, which is drumming up business about youth crime, is actually incorrect, because down here, if we look at the statistics at that deeper level, it doesn't reflect what's going on in the newspaper. So that's what we call critical depth, okay? I hope that example makes it a little bit easier for you to understand. You also need to locate what's happening in the wider social context, and I flagged this a little bit in that introductory lecture that I put up that introduced you to the unit. You see what processes are occurring at the micro level as part of a more holistic social, political, cultural, even historical picture at the micro level. So again, the example that I used before in that original lecture was a person who's, you've come into contact with a person in crisis. Mental health issues are an issue. It might be that person's Muslim, which is part of the issue, and it's making things difficult in that interaction for you. It might be that person is seriously under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and that's making the specific incident difficult for you. So there's a whole range of different social, cultural, economic, even historical, where you might be dealing with a person who is Aboriginal, and immediately all of that historical stuff that happened between police and Aboriginal people, comes into play. So that's that broader context that I was talking about before. So this is critically reflective practice. It's that critical depth, and it's about thinking about that wider social, cultural, historical, economic, whatever it might be, context which is influencing the situation at the time. So it's a process of looking back in a critical way at what has occurred and using the results of this process together with professional knowledge, with the technical and ethical aspects, to tackle new situations. That's a really lovely little quote from Proctor that's cited in Thomas and Thomas. Very quickly, being critical is not these things. It's not about being unappreciative. It's not about screaming expletives at people. It's not about being, hurling criticism at someone, okay? That's a very different form of critical, okay? A critical's also not about a crisis point. Oftentimes, when we think of critical skills units and all of those types of things, it's that crisis point. And I've got a picture here from the Lint Cafe on my slides. It's very often how police think about critical. It's that crisis moment. But that's not how we're thinking about critical in this assignment. You can definitely focus on a crisis moment if that's the challenging or difficult incident that you want to focus on for your assessment. But that's not what we're talking about in this particular not the type of critical that we're focusing on this assignment, all right? I hope that makes that a little bit clearer. So critical's about questioning, not taking things for granted, especially social arrangements that are based on inequality and disadvantage. And I really like this particular quote from Aldous Huxley. Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. I'm going to say that human beings do not learn very much from the lessons of history is most important of all the lessons of history. So Taylor, this is a very complex referencing process. Taylor in 2006, who was cited in Thompson and Thompson, talks about Bandman and Bandman in 1995 to try and demonstrate what critically reflective thinking is about. And they've got a few really interesting little points here. Critical thinking is the rational examination of ideas, inferences, statements, beliefs, and actions. It includes scientific reasoning, decision-making, and reasoning about issues. So this is where we make our link to that literature. That's that scientific reasoning process. It's also reasoning in which we analyse the use of language, formulate problems, clarify and explicate assumptions, weigh up that evidence, evaluate conclusions, discriminate between good and bad arguments, and seek to justify those facts that result in credible beliefs and actions. So again, this is just broadening out what is critical and how do we think about it. That's pretty much it. I hope that was really useful. If you have any questions at all about this assessment or about what we mean by any of these ideas in this particular unit, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me at any time. But for now, that is it, and I shall say goodbye. Thanks for listening, and I'll hope to chat to you over the course of the semester. See you later.